Welcome to the Explainer, where we break down big ideas. Today, we're tackling a huge topic marriage, but through a really specific and honestly pretty challenging legal and theological lens. So, why even talk about this? Well, get this. A Forbes advisor survey found that a staggering 63% of divorcees believe they might have avoided splitting up if they just had a better understanding of what marital commitment was all about. I mean, that's a massive number, right? It really points to a major confusion around the promises we make. Okay, so with that in mind, today we're going to dive into a really specific, and I'll say pretty challenging perspective from the book Marriage, Divorce, and Remarriage by Michael S. Sand. We're going to walk through its argument in 5 parts. First, the legal blueprint of marriage. Then we'll look at 2 different models. After that, we'll break down what the book calls the unilateral covenant. From there, we'll see how divorce works under those rules. And finally, we'll compare the then versus the now. All right, let's get right into it. The entire argument in this book really hangs on one single fundamental question about what exactly marriage is. And that question is marriage a contract or is it a covenant? See, the book argues that its whole interpretation of the biblical view of marriage comes down to the difference between these 2 words. The author's point is that we tend to mix them up, and that if we really understand them, it unlocks everything about the kind of lifelong commitment the book is describing. So, this brings us to the core of the idea the book's distinction between 2 totally different models of agreement. And believe me, they come with completely different rules and expectations. Okay, so look at this. On one side, you've got the bilateral contract. The book links this to Greco Roman law. It's basically a promise for a promise. Think of a modern business deal. We both agree to do something, and the deal depends on both of us holding up our end. But then on the other side, you have this thing the source calls the unilateral covenant, which it connects to ancient Jewish law. This is totally different. It's a promise for a performance. So one person makes a big promise and the other person accepts it, not by promising something back, but by doing something specific. Okay, so let's dig deeper into that second one, the unilateral covenant, because this is where the book's main argument for marriage really starts to build. So, first off, what even is a covenant according to this book? Well, it's not just some temporary deal. It's presented as this permanent, lifelong commitment that actually changes who you are, your status. And it's not just enforced by courts, but by natural or even divine law, often sealed with a super serious oath. Now, a really central piece of this model, as the book describes it, is the bride price. And the author is very clear this isn't just a symbolic thing. It's described as a literal transaction, the specific act where the groom acquires his wife, and legal authority over her is transferred from her father to him. And to back this up, the text points directly to this verse from Genesis. Within the book's framework, this specific passage is interpreted as the theological basis for the husband's rule or his dominion inside that marriage covenant. So it all comes down to these 3 pillars that, according to the source, establish this kind of marriage. You've got the bride price, which is the transfer of authority, then the betrothal, which is when the covenant is formally made, and finally, consummation. This is seen as the woman's performance, the act that officially accepts and completes the husband's one-way promise. Okay, so if that's how this model of marriage is made, how can it be unmade? As you can probably guess, the implications for divorce are, well, they're completely different from how we think about it today. The logic laid out in the source is pretty straightforward. Since the man is the one who unilaterally acquires the woman, he's the only one who has the authority to release her from that covenant. And the book points to this process from Deuteronomy as the only scripturally sanctioned way to do it. It's a 4-step process, and as you can see, it's initiated and carried out completely by the husband. So what about that first step, finding some uncleanness? What does that mean? Well, the book argues that later teachings clarified this to mean porneia. That's the Greek word for sexual immorality. And within this framework, that is the single sole reason a husband is permitted to start this divorce process. And this passage from Romans is used to really drive home the lifelong binding nature of the covenant, specifically for the wife. The book's interpretation is that unless her husband lawfully divorces her for sexual immorality, she is bound to him for life until he dies. Okay, so this all leads to some really specific rules about who can remarry. This table breaks down the book's conclusions on who is considered bound to the marriage and who is loosed or free to get remarried. So, for example, if someone is divorced unlawfully, both of them are still considered bound. But if the divorce for sexual immorality, both of them are considered loosed.
And here's a key one. If a woman initiates the divorce herself, the book concludes she remains bound, but her husband is now loosed and free to remarry. All right, for our last section, let's connect all of this. How does the book link this ancient legal framework to the world we actually live in today? The book lays out this pretty dramatic historical timeline. You see a shift from a system called coverture under English common law, where a woman's legal identity was basically absorbed by her husband's, which sounds a lot like that unilateral model, all the way to 1969. That's when no fault divorce starts popping up in the US, which is a total reflection of that bilateral contract style motto we talked about at the beginning. And this right here really puts the two competing traditions side by side. You have the unilateral Jewish model that the source has been detailing versus the bilateral Greco Roman model. And the book notes that this Greco Roman model was actually more egalitarian. It gave women the legal and financial freedom to initiate divorce. The source argues that the unilateral path is what really shaped early Christian views, while that other, bilateral path, is what ended up influencing modern Western law. So, in the end, by laying out this whole historical and theological framework, the source really challenges our modern ideas about marriage. It kind of forces us to ask, what do we actually mean when we promise to be with someone for life? And that leaves us with a pretty big, thought provoking question for our own time. In an age that's all about equality, what does it even mean for a commitment to be truly permanent?